When widow Khloe Stoltzfus stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Gunnison, Colorado, she whispered the words that would change 2 lives forever. "I'm too big for you." But mountain man Hyram Boon saw something the whole town missed: perfection wrapped in doubt. What happened next sparked a love story that defied every expectation, challenged every assumption, and proved that sometimes the heart sees what the eyes cannot. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The September sun hung low over the Colorado Territory when the Wells Fargo stagecoach rolled into Gunnison, its wheels grinding against the dusty main street like thunder announcing a storm. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, Khloe Stoltzfus pressed her face against the small window, watching the rough frontier town unfold before her eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from the jarring ride, but from the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. At 28, Khloe had never imagined she'd be traveling alone to marry a stranger. Back in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, her Amish community had whispered behind their hands about the widow who couldn't find another husband. At nearly 6 feet tall, with curves that filled out her plain dress in ways that made the church elders uncomfortable, she'd been told more than once that she was too much woman for any decent man to handle. When the advertisement appeared in The Budget, "Mountain man seeks devoted wife, must be strong, faithful, and prepared for frontier life," desperation had driven her to respond. 3 letters later, she was bound for Colorado to marry Hyram Boon, a man she'd never seen but who'd promised her a home and protection in exchange for companionship and housekeeping. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Morrison's General Store, and the driver's gruff voice cut through her thoughts. "End of the line, ma'am. Gunnison, Colorado Territory." Khloe's hands trembled as she smoothed her dark blue dress and adjusted her prayer cap. Through the window, she could see a small crowd gathering weathered cowboys, a few women in faded calico dresses, and children with dirt-smudged faces, all of them staring, all of them waiting to see the mail-order bride who'd come to claim the hermit of Thunder Ridge. The driver opened the door and extended a calloused hand. "Come on down, miss. Your intended should be here somewhere." Taking a deep breath that tasted of dust and sage, Khloe accepted his help and stepped down from the coach. The moment her boots touched the wooden sidewalk, conversation stopped. Every eye fixed on her tall frame, and she heard the whispers start immediately. Lord Almighty, look at the size of her. Poor Hyram. What's he gotten himself into? That woman could wrestle a bear. Heat flooded Khloe's cheeks, but she kept her chin up, scanning the crowd for any man who might step forward to claim her. Seconds stretched into eternity as she stood there, her single carpetbag clutched in white-knuckled hands, while the townspeople gawked like she was some exotic animal on display. Then she saw him. At the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind a hitching post, stood a man who seemed carved from the mountains themselves. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that brushed his collar and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months, he watched her with eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were clean, but worn wool shirt, leather vest, and boots that had walked countless miles of rocky terrain. There was something in his expression that made her breath catch, not the mockery or pity she'd expected, but something that looked almost like wonder. "You Hyram Boon," called out Jake Morrison, the store owner, noticing her gaze. "Your bride's here." The crowd turned to look at the mountain man, and nervous laughter rippled through them. Someone muttered, "This ought to be interesting," and Khloe felt her heart sink to her toes. Hyram Boon stepped forward slowly like a wild animal, unsure whether to approach or flee. He was even bigger than she'd first thought, easily 6'4", with hands that could probably span her waist and shoulders that blocked out the sun. When he stopped in front of her, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the mountain man's reaction to his oversized bride. Khloe felt tears prick her eyes as she prepared for the rejection she'd faced so many times before. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm probably not what you expected. I know I'm too big for, ma'am. His voice was deep and quiet, cutting through her words like a gentle knife. You're perfect. The crowd gasped. Khloe blinked hard, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what did you say? Hyram's weathered face softened, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. I said you're perfect, just exactly what I've been praying for. A woman behind them snorted with laughter. Hyram Boon, you must be blind as a bat. That woman's bigger than most men in this town. Hyram turned slowly to face the crowd, and something in his expression made the laughter die away. Any man who judges a woman by her size instead of her heart is a fool, he said quietly. And I may be many things, but I'm not a fool. He turned back to Khloe, and she saw something in his storm-gray eyes that no man had ever looked at her with before: appreciation. Not tolerance, not resignation, but genuine appreciation for exactly who she was. Miss Stoltzfus, he said formally, removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair. I'm Hyram Boon. I'm honored to meet you. Khloe felt tears spill over despite her efforts to contain them. The honor is mine, Mr. Boon. Just Hyram, if you please. We don't stand much on ceremony up in the mountains. He gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two powerful draft horses. I've got the wagon ready for the ride up to the cabin. It's about 3 hours through some rough country, but the horses are sure-footed. As they walked toward the wagon, the crowd began to disperse, but Khloe could still hear the whispers following them. Mark my words, this won't last a month. Poor fellow doesn't know what he's getting himself into. That woman'll lead him out of house and home. Hyram must have heard them too, because his jaw tightened and his step quickened. When they reached the wagon, he turned to help her up, and Khloe hesitated. Hyram, she said quietly, maybe we should talk first, in private. I need to tell you some things about myself, about why I really came here. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. There's a quiet spot behind the church. We can talk there. They walked in silence through the dusty streets, past the saloon where piano music spilled through the batwing doors, past the blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm. The little white church sat at the end of the street, its simple bell tower reaching toward the mountains like a prayer made manifest. Behind the church, a small garden bloomed with late-season wildflowers. Hyram gestured to a wooden bench beneath a cottonwood tree, and they sat down together, careful to maintain a respectable distance. What did you want to tell me? He asked gently. Khloe twisted her hands in her lap, struggling to find the words. Back home in Pennsylvania, I was married to a man named Ezra Stoltzfus. He died 2 years ago in a farming accident, and I've been living with his family ever since. But lately, she paused, swallowing hard. Lately, they've made it clear that I'm a burden. The other women in our community whisper that I'm too old, too tall, too much for any decent man to want as a wife. Hyram's expression darkened. They told you that? Not in so many words, but I heard them talking. They think I should be grateful for any man who'll have me, even if he's old or cruel or... She trailed off, unable to voice the worst of what she'd overheard. And that's why you answered my advertisement. Khloe nodded miserably. I was desperate. I thought maybe out here away from all the expectations and judgments I might find someone who could accept me as I am. But when I saw how those people looked at me just now, I realized I was fooling myself. Even here, I'm still too much. Hyram was quiet for so long that Khloe began to think he was reconsidering their arrangement. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Miss Khloe, can I tell you something about myself? She nodded, not trusting her voice. I've been alone on that mountain for 8 years now. 8 years of talking to no one but my horses and the occasional trading partner who comes through. Do you know why? Because you prefer solitude. He shook his head. because every woman I ever tried to court took one look at me and decided I was too rough, too quiet, too different for civilized company. They wanted men who could talk pretty and dance at social gatherings and fit into their neat little worlds. They couldn't see past the beard and the calloused hands to the man underneath. Khloe stared at him in amazement. "But you're kind and gentle and you can see that because you know what it's like to be judged by appearances instead of character." He turned to face her fully. "Khloe, when I placed that advertisement, I wasn't looking for a delicate flower who'd wilt at the first sign of hardship. I was looking for a partner, someone strong enough to build a life in the wilderness, brave enough to take a chance on a stranger, and wise enough to know that real worth isn't measured by society's narrow standards." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his massive one. "You are exactly what I prayed for, strong and faithful and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with size or convention." "Beautiful," Khloe whispered the word foreign on her tongue. "Beautiful," he confirmed. "The way mountain wildflowers are beautiful, not because they're small and delicate, but because they're brave enough to bloom where others can't survive." For the first time in years, Khloe felt something unfurl in her chest, a tiny seed of hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who could love her exactly as she was. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I need to tell you before we go any further." Hyram waited patiently, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. "I may never be able to give you children. Ezra and I tried for 5 years and—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Khloe," Hyram's voice was infinitely gentle. "A marriage is about two people choosing to build a life together. Children are a blessing if they come, but they're not the foundation of love. If God sees fit to bless us with little ones, we'll welcome them with joy. If not, we'll find other ways to fill our home with love." The tears came then flowing freely down her cheeks as years of shame and inadequacy poured out of her. Hyram didn't try to stop her crying or offer empty platitudes. He simply held her hand and waited as steady and patient as the mountains themselves. When the tears finally subsided, Khloe wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and looked up at him. "Are you certain about this? Because once we say our vows, there's no going back. I won't be sent away like an unwanted package." "I'm more certain of this than I've ever been of anything in my life," Hyram said firmly. "The question is, are you willing to take a chance on a rough mountain man who can offer you nothing but hard work, simple living, and a heart that's been waiting 8 years to love someone?" Khloe studied his face, the strong jaw, the gentle eyes, the hands that could probably break a man in half, but held hers like she was made of spun glass. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'm willing." Hyram's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then let's go find that preacher and make this official." As they walked back toward the church, Khloe felt lighter than she had in years. The townspeople still stared, but their whispers no longer had the power to wound her. She had found someone who saw her worth, someone who chose her not despite her differences, but because of them. "Hyram," she said as they climbed the church steps. "Yes, thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me, the real me." He stopped at the church door and turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "Khloe Stoltzfus, you are impossible to miss. You're like a beacon on a dark night, bright and strong and true. Any man who couldn't see that was blind." Inside the little church, Reverend Matthews performed a simple ceremony witnessed by the setting sun streaming through stained glass windows. When Hyram slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring he'd had made by the town's blacksmith months ago in hopeful preparation, Khloe felt the last of her doubts melt away. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend announced with a smile. Hyram leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Khloe rose up on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise for all the tomorrows they would share. When they broke apart, Khloe was amazed to see tears in her new husband's eyes. "Mrs. Boon," he whispered, and the name sounded like music. "Mr. Boon," she whispered back, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. As they stepped out of the church into the gathering dusk, the mountains loomed before them like ancient guardians. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to live together, building a partnership, creating a home in the wilderness. But tonight, as Hyram helped her into the wagon and they began the long journey up into the Colorado Rockies, Khloe felt nothing but anticipation. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach believing she was too big for anyone to want was gone. In her place sat Khloe Boon, wife and partner to a man who saw her strength as beauty and her differences as gifts. The mountains ahead were vast and wild and beautiful, just like the love that was already beginning to bloom between them. As the wagon wheels turned and carried them toward their new life, neither of them looked back at the town that had witnessed their beginning. They were too busy looking forward to the future they would build together one day at a time in the shadow of Thunder Ridge. The wagon wheels found their rhythm as they climbed higher into the Colorado mountains, each turn revealing vistas more breathtaking than the last. Khloe pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening air grew crisp, watching her new husband guide the horses along the narrow mountain trail with practiced ease. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the beginning of understanding, two souls learning to exist in the same space. "How much farther?" she asked as they rounded another bend, the lights of Gunnison now just a distant twinkle far below. "Another hour, maybe less," Hyram replied, his voice carrying easily over the creaking of the wagon. "The trail gets steeper from here, but lightning and thunder know the way, even in the dark." Khloe smiled at the names of his horses. Lightning and Thunder. Found them both as colts during a terrible storm about 5 years back. Their mother had been killed by a mountain lion, and they were huddled together under a ledge, scared and alone. He reached forward to pat Thunder's neck affectionately, nursed them through that first winter, and they've been my constant companions ever since. There was something in the way he spoke about rescuing the orphaned horses that made Khloe's heart warm. This man understood what it meant to be lost and alone, to need someone willing to take a chance on you. As they climbed higher, the landscape transformed around them. Towering pines gave way to groves of aspen trees, whose golden leaves shimmered in the moonlight like scattered coins. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the mountainsides like ancient monuments, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of rushing water. "That's Willow Creek," Hyram explained, noticing her listening. "It runs right past the cabin. Best water you'll ever taste, cold and clean, straight from the snowmelt." The wagon jolted over a particularly rough section of trail, and Khloe gripped the seat to steady herself. Hyram immediately slowed the horse's concern, evident in his voice. "You all right? I'm sorry about that. This old trail's seen better days." "I'm fine," she assured him, though she appreciated his consideration. "I'm stronger than I look." "I don't doubt that for a minute," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, even in the darkness. They rode in comfortable silence for a while longer, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of hooves on stone and the whisper of wind through the pines. Khloe found herself stealing glances at her husband's profile, trying to reconcile the gentle man beside her with the rough mountain hermit the townspeople had described. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Anything." "What made you decide to place that advertisement? You seem like a man who values his solitude." Hyram was quiet for so long that Khloe began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was choosing each one carefully. "Last winter was the hardest I'd ever faced up here. Not because of the weather, I've weathered worse storms, but because for the first time the silence felt like a prison instead of a sanctuary." He guided the horses around a fallen log that had rolled onto the trail. "I'd wake up mornings and realize I hadn't spoken a word out loud in weeks. Started talking to the horses more, then to myself, then to the mountains themselves. That's when I knew I was either going crazy or dying inside, maybe both. Khloe felt her throat tighten at the loneliness in his voice. I'd always told myself I was better off alone, he continued. Safer that way. Can't disappoint someone if they're not there to disappoint. But last spring, when the snow melted and the wildflowers started blooming, I looked around at all that beauty and realized I had no one to share it with. That's when I decided I'd rather risk disappointment than guarantee loneliness. And now, she asked softly. He turned to look at her, and even in the moonlight she could see the sincerity in his eyes. Now I feel like I've been holding my breath for 8 years and can finally exhale. The trail leveled out somewhat, and Hyram pointed ahead to where a warm golden light flickered through the trees. There she is, home. Khloe's first glimpse of the cabin took her breath away. It wasn't the rough shack she'd been expecting, but a solid log structure that seemed to grow naturally from the mountainside itself. Warm light spilled from windows flanked by shutters Hyram had obviously crafted himself, and smoke curled from a stone chimney that spoke of cozy fires and home-cooked meals. A covered porch wrapped around the front of the cabin with a wooden swing that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Hyram, it's beautiful, she breathed. Built most of it myself over the years, he said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. Started with just one room, but kept adding on. Always figured someday I might have reason to need the extra space. As they drew closer, Khloe could see the care that had gone into every detail. The logs were perfectly chinked, the windows fitted with real glass, instead of oiled paper, and wildflowers had been planted in wooden boxes beneath each sill. This wasn't the dwelling of a man who'd given up on life. This was the home of someone who'd been preparing, hoping, waiting for the right person to share it with. Hyram brought the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and set the brake. Before Khloe could even begin to climb down, he was there beside her, offering his hand with the same gentle courtesy he'd shown all evening. "Welcome home, Mrs. Boon," he said as her feet touched the ground. The words sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Home. When was the last time anywhere had truly felt like home? "It's more wonderful than I imagined," she said honestly. "You've built something truly special here." Hyram's smile was shy, but pleased. "Let me show you inside, then I'll get your bag and see to the horses." He led her up the porch steps, the boards solid and silent beneath their feet. The front door was heavy oak, fitted with hinges. He'd obviously forged himself, and when he opened it, warm air scented with pine smoke and something that smelled suspiciously like fresh bread wafted out to greet them. The interior of the cabin was as impressive as the exterior. The main room was spacious and welcoming, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows that would flood the space with light during the day. Handcrafted furniture, a table that could seat 6 chairs with carved backs, shelves lined with books filled the room without crowding it. Braided rugs covered the wide plank floors, and oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the log walls. "The kitchen's through there," Hyram said, pointing to an archway that led to what she could see was a well-appointed cooking area. "And there are 2 bedrooms. The larger one is yours, of course. I'll take the smaller one until you're comfortable with whatever arrangements you'd prefer." The thoughtfulness of his words, the way he was giving her space to adjust and choose, made Khloe's heart squeeze. She turned to face him, this gentle giant who'd already shown her more consideration than she'd received in years. "Hyram, I want you to know that I don't expect you to change your entire life because I'm here. This is your home, and I'm grateful to be welcomed into it." "Our home," he corrected gently. "As of about 2 hours ago, this became our home." The word "our" hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Khloe looked around the cabin again, trying to imagine herself here, trying to picture days filled with purpose and evenings spent by the fire with this kind, quiet man. "I should warn you," Hyram said, suddenly looking uncertain. "I'm not much of a cook. I can manage the basics, beans, bacon, biscuits when I remember to buy flour in town, but I'm afraid you'll find the larder pretty sparse." Khloe smiled, feeling the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in a long time, excitement about the future. "Cooking is something I actually enjoy. Back in Pennsylvania, I did most of the meal preparation for Ezra's family. There's something satisfying about taking simple ingredients and turning them into something that nourishes and comforts." Relief flooded Hyram's features. "I was hoping you'd say that. I stocked up on supplies before I went to town to fetch you, but I'll admit I wasn't sure what you'd need. Why don't you show me the kitchen while you tell me about what you have stored away?" The kitchen was a revelation. Hyram had built in ample counter space, installed a large cast-iron stove that looked brand new, and crafted cabinets with actual doors instead of the open shelving she'd expected. A hand pump brought water directly to a deep sink, and through the window above it she could see the creek he'd mentioned, sparkling in the moonlight. "Good Lord, Hyram, this kitchen is better equipped than most of the ones back home," she said, running her hand along the smooth countertop. "You built all of this yourself. Had to order the stove from Denver, but yeah, the rest I made." He opened one of the cabinets to reveal shelves lined with supplies. "I've got flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and a few other basics. There's a root cellar out back where I keep potatoes and such, and I managed to put up some preserves from the wild berries that grow around here." Khloe examined his stores with a practiced eye, already planning meals in her head. "This is a good start. Do you hunt?" "Some, mostly deer and elk, though I try not to take more than I need. There's a smokehouse behind the cabin where I cure the meat. And a garden. Started one this spring, but I'll admit it's not much to look at. I'm better with animals than I am with vegetables." Khloe smiled, imagining the possibilities. "I'd love to see it tomorrow. I've always enjoyed gardening. There's something hopeful about planting seeds and trusting that they'll grow." They talked quietly for a few more minutes about practical matters, where things were stored, how the stove worked, the location of the well and the woodshed. But underneath the mundane conversation, Khloe sensed something deeper growing between them. Not love, not yet, that would take time, but something that could become love given the right conditions. Respect, understanding, and the willingness to build something together. "I should let you get settled," Hyram said finally. "Tomorrow will be soon enough to start figuring out how we want to organize things." "Before you go," Khloe said, suddenly needing to know, "what do your days usually look like? I want to understand how I can be helpful instead of just in the way." Hyram leaned against the doorframe, considering her question. "Well, the horses need tending morning and evening. There's always wood to be cut and split for the winter. Up here you can never have too much firewood. I do some trapping when the season's right, and I make the trip down to Gunnison about once a month for supplies and to trade pelts. What about repairs and maintenance? Always something that needs fixing or improving. This old cabin's solid, but mountain weather's hard on everything. Plus, I've been wanting to expand the root cellar and maybe add on a proper workshop." Khloe nodded, her mind already working. "I can help with a lot of that. I'm handy with a hammer, and saw had to be living where I did, and I'd love to work on expanding the garden come spring." "You really want to do this," Hyram said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Make a life here, I mean. It's not going to be easy. Winters are long and hard, the nearest neighbors are miles away, and some weeks the only faces you'll see are mine and the horses." Khloe met his gaze steadily. "Hyram, I've spent the last 2 years feeling like a burden, like someone just taking up space in other people's lives. The chance to be useful, to build something meaningful with someone who values what I can contribute, that's not a hardship. That's a gift." Something shifted in Hyram's expression. A wall coming down that she hadn't even realized was there. "I keep waiting for you to change your mind," he said quietly. "To realize what you've gotten yourself into and decide you've made a mistake." "The only mistake I made was waiting so long to find you," Khloe said, surprised by her own boldness. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the kitchen, two people who'd found something they hadn't even known they were looking for. Then Hyram cleared his throat and straightened up. "I'll get your bag and let you get some rest. Morning comes early up here." "Hyram," she called as he turned to go. "Yeah, thank you for all of this, for seeing possibilities instead of problems." His smile was soft and real. "Thank you for being brave enough to come all this way to give us a chance." After he left to tend to the horses and bring in her carpet bag, Khloe explored the cabin more thoroughly. The bedroom he'd given her was spacious and comfortable, with a large window that would provide morning light and a view of the mountains. The bed was obviously handmade, but crafted with skill and care, piled high with quilts that looked like they'd come from the general store in town. Her few possessions looked lost in the large room, but somehow that felt appropriate. She was starting fresh here, leaving behind the person she'd been and growing into whoever she was meant to become. As she unpacked her spare dress and few personal items, she felt lighter than she had in years. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "I left your bag by the door," Hyram called through the wood. "Sleep well, Khloe. We'll talk more in the morning." "Good night, Hyram," she called back. "Thank you for everything." She heard his footsteps retreat across the main room, then the sound of the smaller bedroom door closing. For the first time in years, Khloe was truly alone, but not lonely. She was alone in her own space, in her own home, with the promise of tomorrow bright ahead of her. As she prepared for bed washing at the basin Hyram had thoughtfully filled with fresh water, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at her was still tall, still curved in ways that defied convention, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time in her adult life, she looked at herself and saw what Hyram saw, not too much, but just enough. Not a burden, but a blessing. Outside her window, the mountain night was alive with sounds, the whisper of wind through pine trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of the creek. This was her world now, vast and wild and beautiful, shared with a man who valued strength over fragility and substance over appearance. As sleep finally claimed her, Khloe's last conscious thought was of morning, of waking up in this place, in this life, with work to do and a partner to share it with. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was eager to see what tomorrow would bring. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that took Khloe's breath away when she opened her bedroom curtains. She'd slept better than she had in months, lulled by the mountain air and the profound sense of safety that came from knowing she was wanted here. The cabin was quiet, but she could smell coffee and hear the soft sounds of someone moving around in the kitchen. She dressed quickly in her practical brown dress and pinned her hair back under her prayer cap, then made her way toward the wonderful smell of fresh coffee. She found Hyram standing at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet with the concentration of a man who'd learned to cook through necessity rather than joy. He'd already been outside, his boots were damp with dew, and his hair showed the signs of a quick wash at the pump. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned with a smile that made her heart do something funny in her chest. "Morning, Khloe. I hope the coffee's all right. I tend to make it strong enough to wake the dead." "Strong coffee sounds perfect." She accepted the cup he offered her and took a careful sip. It was indeed strong, but rich and warming. "How long have you been up?" "About an hour. Old habits. I usually check on the horses first thing, then start the coffee." He gestured toward the skillet. "I was attempting breakfast, but I should probably warn you that my cooking skills haven't improved overnight." Khloe moved to stand beside him at the stove, close enough to smell the clean scent of soap and mountain air that clung to his skin. "Mind if I take over? I've been cooking for a crowd for years. This will feel like a vacation." Relief flooded his features. "I was hoping you'd say that." As she took the spatula from his hands, Their fingers brushed and Khloe felt a little jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with static electricity. Hyram seemed to feel it too because he stepped back quickly, color rising in his cheeks. "I'll just go check on the horses again," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Breakfast will be ready when you get back." Khloe called after him, trying to ignore the way her pulse had quickened. Alone in the kitchen, she took stock of what Hyram had started and began to really cook for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania. She found eggs in this cold box he'd built into the north wall of the cabin, and soon the smell of bacon, eggs, and biscuits filled the air. It felt wonderful to be useful again, to create something nourishing with her own hands. When Hyram returned, his eyes widened at the transformation. The table was set for two, and a plate piled high with golden biscuits sat next to perfectly cooked eggs and crispy bacon. "Khloe, this looks incredible. I can't remember the last time I had a real breakfast." "Sit," she commanded gently, filling his plate before serving herself. "Food tastes better when you're not the one cooking it." They ate in comfortable quiet, the morning sun streaming through the windows and the sound of the creek providing a peaceful soundtrack. Khloe found herself stealing glances at her husband as he ate, noting the way he savored each bite and the genuine appreciation in his expression. "This is the best meal I've had in years," he said, finally leaning back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. "It's just eggs and bacon," Khloe protested, but she was pleased by his praise. "Maybe, but you put care into it. I can taste the difference." As they lingered over their coffee, Khloe felt the last of her doubts about this arrangement fade away. This felt right, the two of them sharing a meal, planning their day, building the foundation of something that could last. "What would you like to tackle first today?" she asked. "I'm eager to start learning how everything works around here." Hyram's smile was answer enough. This was going to work. They were going to work. "Why don't we start with the garden?" Hyram suggested, pushing back from the table. "I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we might do with it come spring." They walked together through the crisp morning air, their breath forming small clouds as they talked. Behind the cabin, Khloe could see the modest plot Hyram had mentioned. A rectangular patch of earth, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with the remnants of what had been a valiant but inexperienced attempt at vegetable gardening. "I can see you tried," she said, kindly examining the withered tomato plants and overgrown bean rows. "The location is perfect, good southern exposure and protection from the wind." "I had grand plans," Hyram admitted ruefully, "but it turns out there's more to gardening than just putting seeds in the ground and hoping for the best." Khloe knelt and scooped up a handful of the dark mountain soil, crumbling it between her fingers. "The earth is good here, rich and well-drained. With some planning and proper preparation, we could grow enough vegetables to last us through the winter, maybe even have some to trade in town." As she spoke, her excitement grew. She could envision rows of carrots and potatoes, beans, climbing up sturdy poles, squash vines, spreading across carefully prepared hills. "We could expand it too, double the size at least. And over there," she pointed to a sunny slope beyond the current garden that would be perfect for an herb garden. "I know which plants grow well at this altitude." Hyram watched her with growing amazement. "You really know about this stuff, don't you?" "I've been gardening since I was old enough to hold a hoe," she replied, standing and brushing the soil from her hands. "My mother always said that a woman who could coax food from the earth would never go hungry, and a family with a good garden was richer than one with a full purse." "Then come spring, we'll expand it however you think best," Hyram said decisively. "I'll clear the ground and build whatever raised beds or fencing you need." They spent the next hour walking the property, with Hyram showing her the smokehouse, the root cellar, and the small barn where lightning and thunder lived in comfortable stalls. Khloe was impressed by the care he'd taken with every structure. Nothing was built hastily or carelessly. This was the work of a man who built things to last. "You mentioned trapping," she said, as they examined the various outbuildings. "What kind of animals?" "Mostly beaver and marten for the fur trade. Some rabbit and squirrel for meat. There's good money in quality pelts, and it helps supplement what I make from the occasional odd job in town." "I could help with that," Khloe offered Don. "I know how to skin and prepare pelts properly. My father used to trap some when I was growing up." Hyram stopped walking and turned to look at her. "Khloe, is there anything you can't do?" She laughed, a sound that echoed pleasantly off the surrounding mountains. "Plenty. I can't carry a tune to save my life. I'm terrible at fancy needlework, and I have absolutely no talent for painting or drawing. But practical things, cooking, gardening, preserving food, mending clothes, basic carpentry, those I can do." "Those are exactly the skills that matter up here," Hyram said warmly. "I think I got the better end of this bargain by about a mile." As they made their way back toward the cabin, a rider appeared on the trail below, moving at a steady pace up the mountainside. Hyram's expression grew guarded as he watched the approaching figure. "Someone you know?" Khloe asked, noting the change in his demeanor. "Jake Morrison from the general store." Hyram replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Wonder what brings him up here." They waited on the porch as the storekeeper rode into the clearing. Jake Morrison was a thin, weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a perpetually calculating expression. He touched his hat politely to Khloe, but addressed his words to Hyram. "Morning, Hyram. Mrs. Boon," he added as an obvious afterthought. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "What can I do for you, Jake?" Hyram asked, his tone friendly but wary. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, taking his time about it in a way that suggested he was gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words came carefully. "Well, it's like this. Yesterday, after you and the missus left town, I got to thinking about some business that might concern you both." Khloe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. There was something in the man's tone that spoke of trouble. "What kind of business?" Hyram asked quietly. Jake reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, yellow with age and official-looking seals. "This came for you about 3 months ago, Hyram. Forgot about it until yesterday, what with all the excitement and such. But seeing your new bride got me thinking I should probably pass it along." Hyram took the envelope with obvious reluctance, examining the return address. His face went pale as he read it. "What is it?" Khloe asked, moving closer to him instinctively. "Legal notice," Hyram said grimly, "from a law firm in Denver." Jake cleared his throat. "Thing is, Hyram, there's more. This morning I got another visitor fellow named Bartholomew Crane. Says he represents some gentleman with interests in mining claims around these parts." The name hit Khloe like a physical blow. Bartholomew Crane had been one of Ezra's creditors back in Pennsylvania, a man who collected debts with ruthless efficiency and little compassion. What was he doing here? "You know this man?" Hyram asked, noticing her reaction. Khloe struggled to find her voice. "Yes, I know him. He's a debt collector, a very persistent one." Jake nodded grimly. "Thought you might. He was asking questions about you, Mrs. Boon. Seemed to know quite a bit about your circumstances back east." Hyram's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Where you were living now, whether you had any assets or income. He also seemed mighty interested in this property." Jake gestured toward the cabin and surrounding land. "Asked if it was profitable, whether you'd be staying long, that sort of thing." Khloe felt the blood drain from her face. She'd thought she'd left all of that behind in Pennsylvania, but apparently the past had followed her even here. "Did you tell him anything?" Hyram asked sharply. "Course not," Jake replied, looking offended. "I may be a businessman, but I'm not a gossip. Told him he'd have to ask you folks directly if he wanted information." "Where is he now?" Khloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Took a room at the hotel. Said he'd be staying a few days to conduct his business." Made it sound real, official, and important. Hyram opened the legal envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. As he read the contents, his expression grew darker with each line. Finally, he looked up at Khloe with eyes full of concern. "It's a notice about back taxes on this property." he said quietly. Apparently there was some confusion about the ownership after my father died, and the county's been trying to collect for 3 years. How much? Khloe asked, though she dreaded the answer. $800. The amount hung in the air between them like a death sentence. $800 was more money than most people saw in several years, and Khloe knew from their conversation the night before that Hyram lived simply precisely because his income was modest and uncertain. There's more, Jake said reluctantly. This fellow Crane mentioned something about debts from Pennsylvania, said he was authorized to collect on behalf of multiple creditors. Khloe closed her eyes, feeling the life she'd just begun to build crumbling around her. How much does he say I owe? Didn't give me specifics, but he mentioned a figure of $1,200. The number hit her like a physical blow. $1,200 plus the $800 in back taxes meant they were facing a debt of $2,000, an impossible sum. I'm sorry, Khloe, Jake said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he sounded genuinely sympathetic. I thought you should know what you're up against. After Jake left, promising to send word, if Crane made any more inquiries, Khloe and Hyram sat on the porch in stunned silence. The morning that had started with such promise now felt shadowed by an insurmountable problem. I should have told you, Khloe said finally, her voice thick with shame, about Ezra's debts. I thought they'd died with him, but apparently some of the creditors decided to pursue his widow. How much did you really owe back in Pennsylvania? Hyram asked gently. I don't know exactly. Ezra handled all the finances, and after he died, different people kept coming forward with claims. Some were legitimate money he'd borrowed for seed or equipment. Others... She shrugged helplessly. I never knew if they were real, or if people were just trying to take advantage of a grieving widow. Hyram was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that surrounded their little valley. When he spoke, his voice was calm but determined. We'll figure this out, he said simply. Hyram, you don't understand. $2,000 is impossible. Most people don't see that kind of money in their entire lives. Most people don't have what we have, he replied, turning to look at her with something that might have been hope in his eyes. What do we have besides a mountain cabin and 2 horses? Hyram smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since Jake's arrival. We have something more valuable than money, Khloe. We have each other, and we have determination. Those are the only tools my father used to build this place, and they're the only tools we need to save it. His confidence was infectious, but Khloe couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her chest like a cold stone. But what if we can't? What if Crane takes legal action? What if they force us to sell the property to pay the debts? Then we'll find another mountain and build another cabin, Hyram said with quiet conviction. But I don't think it's going to come to that. How can you be so calm about this? Hyram reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. Because yesterday I was a man alone facing whatever problems came my way. Today I'm a man with a partner, and that changes everything. Despite her fear, Khloe felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. This man who barely knew her was willing to face financial ruin rather than send her away. Whatever happened, they would face it together. What do we do first? She asked. First, we go to town and talk to Crane directly. Find out exactly what he thinks you owe and what proof he has. Then we'll figure out our options. And if his claims are legitimate, Hyram squeezed her hand, then we'll find a way to pay them. I've been on this mountain for 8 years, Khloe. I know every inch of this land, every stream, every game trail. There are resources here that I've never bothered to explore because I didn't need them, but need has a way of making a man creative. That afternoon, they made the trip back down to Gunnison, the wagon wheels retracing the path that had brought them together such a short time ago. The town looked different in daylight, smaller, somehow less significant against the backdrop of their current crisis. They found Bartholomew Crane in the hotel dining room, a thin man with pale eyes and the kind of precise mustache that spoke of vanity and attention to detail. He looked up from his meal as they approached, and his expression shifted from surprise to satisfaction. "Mrs. Stoltzfus," he said, rising from his chair with exaggerated courtesy, "how delightful to see you again, though I believe congratulations are in order. Mrs. Boon now, isn't it?" "Mr. Crane," Khloe replied coolly. "I wasn't expecting to see you in Colorado. Business takes me many places, my dear, and you represent some very persistent business indeed." His eyes shifted to Hyram, evaluating and calculating. "You must be the new husband. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Boon." Hyram didn't offer his hand. "I understand you have some claims against my wife's former circumstances." "Indeed I do." Crane gestured for them to sit, but neither moved to accept his invitation. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. These matters can be quite delicate." "Anything you have to say to my wife, you can say to me," Hyram stated firmly. Crane's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Very well, Mrs. Boon, you are aware, I'm sure, of the substantial debts left behind by your late husband." "I was told most of those debts had been forgiven or dismissed," Khloe said carefully. But that's where you're mistaken." Crane pulled a leather portfolio from beside his chair and extracted several official-looking documents. "I represent a consortium of creditors who have decided to pursue collection through legal channels." He spread the papers on the table like a gambler revealing a winning hand. "Doctors' bills, equipment loans, seed purchases, land taxes. Your husband was quite creative in his borrowing, I'm afraid." Khloe studied the documents, her heart sinking as she recognized some of the names and amounts. "These can't all be legitimate. Some of these claims are for services I know were never provided." "That's a matter for the courts to decide," Crane replied smoothly. "What matters for our purposes is that the total amount owed with accumulated interest and legal fees comes to exactly $1,247. "And you traveled all the way to Colorado to collect this?" Hyram asked skeptically. "I have other business interests in the territory," Crane said. "But yes, the consortium feels that Mrs. Boon's new circumstances, married to a property owner, makes collection more feasible than it was when she was destitute in Pennsylvania." The implication was clear. They'd waited until she had something to lose before pursuing the debt. "What proof do you have that these debts are legitimate?" Hyram demanded. Crane's smile widened. "I have signed contracts, witnessed agreements, and testimony from multiple creditors. More than enough for any territorial court." "And what exactly do you propose we do about this?" Khloe asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I'm prepared to be reasonable." Crane set his tone, suggesting anything but reasonableness. "Pay the full amount within 30 days, and we'll consider the matter closed. Fail to do so, and I'll be forced to pursue legal remedies, which could include seizure of assets to satisfy the debt." "What assets?" Hyram asked quietly. Crane gestured vaguely toward the window beyond which the mountains rose like silent witnesses. "I understand you own a substantial property in the area. Very scenic, I'm told. I'm sure it would fetch a good price from the right buyer." The threat was clear, and Khloe felt sick to her stomach. Not only was she facing the loss of her new home, but she was dragging Hyram down with her. "We'll need time to consider your offer," Hyram said finally. "Of course, but remember 30 days. After that, the matter moves to the courts, and legal fees will be added to the total." Crane began gathering his papers. "I'll be in town for another week, should you wish to discuss terms." As they left the hotel, Khloe felt crushed by the weight of what they faced. $2,000 might as well have been $2 million. It was an impossible sum for people living on the margins of survival. "I'm so sorry," she said as they walked toward their wagon. "I've ruined everything. You should send me back to Pennsylvania and pretend this marriage never happened." Hyram stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face with gentle firmness. "Khloe Boon, don't you ever say anything like that again. We're married, which means we face our problems together, all of them. But the money is just money. We'll find a way to get it." "How? Where could we possibly find $2,000? Hyram was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he looked toward the mountains that surrounded the town. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been excitement. My father used to tell stories about the old days, when he first came to these mountains. He'd talk about streams that ran heavy with gold, about fortunes waiting to be claimed by men brave enough to look for them. Hyram, those are just stories. The gold rush days are over. Maybe, but my father wasn't the kind of man to make up tales just for entertainment. And there's one story he told that he always insisted was true about a claim he staked up on Thunder Ridge back before he met my mother. Khloe felt a stirring of something that might have been hope. What happened to it? He said he never worked it because he fell in love and decided he'd rather build a home than chase gold. But he kept the claim papers, said he was saving them for when they might be needed. Do you still have them? Locked away in his old strongbox along with some other papers I've never bothered to look through. Hyram's grip on her hands tightened. Khloe, it might be nothing. The claim might be worthless or played out or impossible to work, but it's a chance. Looking into his eyes, Khloe saw something she'd never seen before, not just hope, but determination backed by love. This man was willing to risk everything for her, for them, for the life they were trying to build together. Then let's go home and look at those papers, she said firmly. If there's gold on Thunder Ridge, we're going to find it. As they drove back up the mountain trail, the setting sun painted the peaks in shades of gold that seemed like a promise. Behind them, the lights of Gunnison flickered to life, but ahead lay only the darkness of the unknown. Yet for the first time since Crane's arrival, Khloe felt something other than despair. She felt like a woman with a purpose, a partner, and just maybe a fighting chance. The cabin welcomed them back with warm light spilling from its windows, but the comfort of home was overshadowed by the urgency of their mission. As soon as they'd tended to the horses, Hyram led Khloe to a heavy wooden chest that sat beneath the window in their bedroom. "This was my father's," he said, lifting the lid to reveal a collection of papers, letters, and documents tied with ribbon and string. "I haven't looked through most of this since he died." They spread the contents on the kitchen table, sorting through deeds and birth certificates, letters from relatives back east, and faded photographs of people Khloe didn't recognize. Finally, near the bottom of the chest, Hyram found what they were looking for, a leather folder tied with a piece of rawhide. Inside were 3 pieces of paper, an official-looking document with a territorial seal, a hand-drawn maps, and a letter written in the same careful script as the other documents. "This is it," Hyram said, his voice tight with excitement. "The claim deed to a section of Thunder Ridge, filed in 1867. Khloe studied the map, trying to make sense of the rough sketches and notations. "Can you read this? Some of it. This creek here," he pointed to a wavy line on the paper, "that's got to be Willow Creek, and this X marks where he thought the best prospects were." "What does the letter say?" Hyram unfolded the final document and read aloud in his father's words from beyond the grave, "To my son, should he ever have need of what I've found here. The gold is real, though I never took more than a few flakes to test the stream. The mother lode lies somewhere up the ridge, but it will take hard work and harder luck to find it. Use this knowledge only if there's no other way, for gold changes a man, and not always for the better." They looked at each other across the table, the weight of possibility and desperation hanging between them like a bridge they weren't sure they dared to cross. "It's dangerous," Khloe said finally. "Everything worth doing is dangerous," Hyram replied. "We don't know anything about mining. We'll learn. We might not find anything. We might find everything we need." Khloe reached across the table and took his hand. "Then we'd better get started." The first light of dawn found them already preparing for the journey up Thunder Ridge, their breath forming clouds in the crisp mountain air as they loaded supplies into the wagon. Hyram had spent most of the night studying his father's map and gathering the tools they would need: picks, shovels, a gold pan he'd found buried in the barn, and enough food and water for several days of hard work. "You sure about this?" he asked Khloe as she secured a bundle of blankets behind the wagon seat. "The terrain up there is rougher than anything around the cabin. It's going to be backbreaking work with no guarantee of results." Khloe straightened and fixed him with a look of determination that reminded him why he'd fallen for her courage in the first place. "Hyram Boon, 24 hours ago, I was the happiest woman in Colorado territory. I'm not about to let Bartholomew Crane take that away from us without a fight." They followed Willow Creek upstream, the wagon wheels finding purchase on the rocky ground as lightning and thunder picked their way carefully along the narrow trail. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they climbed, and the air grew thinner, making every breath feel precious and deliberate. After 2 hours of steady climbing, they reached the area marked on the old map, a wide bend in the creek where the water pooled before tumbling down a series of natural stone steps. The setting was spectacular, surrounded by towering pines and granite outcroppings that caught the morning light like ancient cathedrals. "This has to be it," Hyram said, comparing the landscape to his father's rough sketches. "Look there, you can see where someone worked the stream bank years ago." Khloe followed his pointing finger and saw the telltale signs of old digging depressions in the earth where someone had moved rocks and diverted water, now grown over with mountain grass and wildflowers. "Your father really was here," she said wonderingly, and according to his notes, he found enough color to know there was more upstream. Hyram unloaded their equipment with methodical efficiency. "The question is whether we can find what he left behind." They started with the basics, using the gold pan to test the creek bed, where Hyram's father had marked his first discovery. The work was harder than either of them had expected, scooping gravel and sand into the shallow pan, then swirling it in the creek water to wash away the lighter materials while hoping that any gold would settle to the bottom. "I feel like I'm doing this wrong," Khloe said, after her third attempt yielded nothing but wet sand and disappointment. "We both are," Hyram admitted, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "But that's why we start simple and learn as we go." By midday, they'd worked their way along 50 yards of creek bank, with nothing to show for their efforts but sore backs and muddy clothes. The sun was high and hot, and doubt was beginning to creep into both their minds like cold water through a cracked dam. "Maybe the gold was all played out years ago," Khloe said, sitting down heavily on a boulder and accepting the cup of water Hyram offered her. "Maybe your father took everything there was to find." "His letter said he barely scratched the surface," Hyram replied, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "And look at this." He showed her the pan from his latest attempt, pointing to what looked like ordinary sand. "See those dark flecks? That's black sand. It's usually found with gold deposits." Khloe leaned closer, studying the contents of the pan. Mixed in with the black sand were several tiny specks that caught the sunlight differently than the surrounding material. "Are those?" "Could be. Let me try something." Hyram carried the pan to a quieter section of the creek and began the careful process of washing away more of the lighter material. With each gentle swirl of water, more sand disappeared until only the heaviest particles remained in the bottom of the pan. When he lifted it from the water, they both caught their breath. Mixed in with the black sand were at least a dozen tiny flakes of unmistakable gold. "We found it," Khloe whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might make the precious metal disappear. "We found some," Hyram corrected, but his grin was infectious. "The question now is whether there's enough to make a difference." They worked with renewed energy through the afternoon, moving systematically along the creek bank and learning through trial and error how to read the water and the land. Each pan yielded a few more flakes, and by evening they had accumulated what looked like about a teaspoon of gold dust and small nuggets. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, they made camp beside the creek, too tired to attempt the journey back to the cabin in the dark. Hyram built a small fire while Khloe prepared a simple meal from their supplies, and they sat together on a fallen log, watching the flames dance and listening to the eternal song of moving water. "How much do you think we found today?" Khloe asked, examining their small collection of gold by firelight. Hard to say without proper scales, but maybe $20 worth. Not enough to solve our problems, but enough to prove there's more where it came from. $20 represented nearly a month's income for most working men, but against their debt of $2,000, it felt like a single drop in a vast ocean. At this rate, it would take us years to collect enough, Khloe said, trying to keep the discouragement from her voice. Unless we can find the source, Hyram replied, pulling out his father's map again. According to this, the real deposit is higher up the ridge. What we're finding in the creek is just what's washed down over the years. You mean we need to go further up the mountain? I mean, we need to find where this gold is coming from originally, the mother lode, as the old-timers called it. That night, sleeping under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any Khloe had ever seen, she dreamed of golden veins running through solid rock and streams that sparkled with more than just reflected moonlight. But she also dreamed of Bartholomew Crane's pale eyes and calculating smile, and she woke before dawn with the absolute certainty that their time was running out faster than water through a broken dam. The second day brought them higher up Thunder Ridge, following game trails and instinct as they searched for the source of the gold they'd found in the creek. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, with loose rock and steep grades that forced them to leave the horses behind and continue on foot. "Look at this," Hyram called from a position about 50 yards ahead of her on the trail. He was kneeling beside a section of exposed rock, running his fingers along what looked like a vein of different-colored stone. Khloe climbed up to join him, her lungs burning from the altitude and exertion. "What is it?" "Quartz," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "And look what's running through it." She followed his pointing finger and saw it thin threads of gold running through the white quartz like veins in a leaf. It wasn't much, but it was visible to the naked eye, which meant there was probably more hidden deeper in the rock. "This could be it," she breathed. "This could be what your father found." "Maybe, but look how high up we are and how hard it would be to get equipment up here." Hyram gestured toward the steep trail they'd just climbed. "Even if this is the mother lode, it might not be practical to work." They spent the rest of the day exploring the area, finding more evidence of gold-bearing quartz, but also discovering the magnitude of the challenge they faced. The deposit, if it truly was as rich as it appeared, was located in one of the most inaccessible parts of the mountain. "We'd need blasting powder to break up the rock," Hyram said as they made their way back down the mountain in the late afternoon, "and some way to transport heavy equipment up that trail. It's not impossible, but it would take time and money we don't have." "What about the creek?" Khloe asked. "We know there's gold there, and it's much easier to work." "True, but at the rate we found yesterday, we'd need months to collect enough to pay our debts. Crane gave us 30 days. They rode back to the cabin in thoughtful silence, each lost in their own calculations of time and resources and impossible mathematics. The gold was real, just as Hyram's father had promised, but the path to claiming it seemed almost as daunting as the debt itself. That evening, as they sat at their kitchen table counting the day's modest findings, a knock at the door interrupted their planning. Hyram answered it to find a man he didn't recognize, tall and thin, with the kind of pale complexion that spoke of too much time spent indoors. "Mr. Boon, I'm Thomas Whitmore, an associate of Mr. Crane's. I wonder if I might have a word with you and your wife." Hyram's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside to let the man enter. "What can we do for you, Mr. Whitmore?" "I've come with what I believe you'll find to be a very reasonable proposition," Whitmore said, accepting the chair Khloe offered him at the table. "Mr. Crane has authorized me to discuss alternative arrangements for settling Mrs. Boon's debt." "What kind of alternatives?" Khloe asked warily. Whitmore smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, it's come to our attention that you own a rather substantial piece of property here. Very scenic, excellent water rights, good access to timber resources. The kind of land that's becoming quite valuable as more people discover the attractions of Colorado territory." Get to the point, Hyram said bluntly. The point, Mr. Boon, is that we're prepared to accept this property in full settlement of the debt. Sign over the deed to us, and Mrs. Boon's obligations will be considered completely satisfied. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Khloe felt her heart sink as she realized what they were really being offered, the chance to lose everything they'd built in exchange for a clean slate. And if we refuse, she asked quietly, then Mr. Crane will be forced to pursue legal remedies, which will likely result in the seizure of the property anyway, along with substantial additional legal fees. Whitmore's tone remained pleasant, but his meaning was clear. This way, at least you avoid the unpleasantness of a court battle. We'll need time to consider your offer, Hyram said carefully. Of course, but I should mention that this generous offer expires in 1 week. After that, Mr. Crane will assume you've chosen the legal route and he'll act accordingly. After Whitmore left, Khloe and Hyram sat in stunned silence. The walls of their home, which had felt so solid and permanent just hours before, now seemed as fragile as paper. A week, Khloe said finally. They've cut our time from 30 days to 1 week. They're pressuring us because they know the property is worth more than the debt, Hyram replied grimly. This isn't about collecting money, it's about taking our land. But what choice do we have? Even if we could find enough gold to pay the debt, there's no way we could do it in a week. Hyram stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that had been his refuge for so many years. When he turned back to face her, his expression was set with a determination she'd never seen before. There might be a way, he said slowly. It's dangerous and it would require help, but there might be a way to get enough gold to satisfy Crane and keep our home. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about dynamite and hard work and the kind of mining operation that built half the fortunes in Colorado. He moved back to the table and spread out his father's map once more. If we can't bring the equipment up to the gold, maybe we can bring the gold down to us. I don't understand. Hyram traced his finger along the creek that ran past their cabin. Water always finds the easiest path down a mountain. If we could divert some of the flow from higher up the ridge, increase the volume and speed of the water in the creek, it might wash down enough gold-bearing gravel to make a difference. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It is, and it would require blasting to redirect the water flow, which means we'd need help from someone who knows about explosives. Khloe studied the map, trying to understand what he was proposing. Who would help us with something like that? There's a man named Murphy who works the mining claims east of here. Irish fellow, been blasting rock longer than anyone in the territory. If anyone could help us set up a hydraulic mining operation, it would be him. Would he do it? For the right price, Murphy would blast a hole to China. The question is whether we can afford him and whether we can make this work in the time we have left. They spent the rest of the evening planning and calculating, trying to work out the logistics of an operation that was equal parts desperate hope and calculated madness. By the time they went to bed, they had the skeleton of a plan that just might work if they could find Murphy, if he would help them if the weather held, and if their luck was better than it had been since Crane's arrival. The next morning, they set out before dawn to find the Irishman, whose knowledge of explosives might be their salvation. The ride to the eastern claims took them through some of the wildest country Khloe had ever seen. Steep valleys carved by ancient glaciers, forests so thick the sun barely penetrated to the forest floor, and peaks that rose like spears into the crystal-clear mountain air. They found Murphy's camp in a narrow canyon, where the sound of his blasting work echoed off the rock walls like thunder. He was a small, wiry man with graying red hair and eyes the color of winter sky, and he listened to their proposal with the kind of attention that suggested he'd heard stranger requests in his time. "So, let me understand this," he said in an accent that carried the music of County Cork. "You want me to help you blast a new channel to increase the water flow in Willow Creek, so you can wash enough gold out of Thunder Ridge to pay off a debt collector in 6 days. That's about the size of it, Hyram confirmed. Murphy was quiet for a long moment, studying the crude map they'd shown him and calculating something in his head. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly. "It's possible," he said finally. "Dangerous as hell, and likely to bring half the ridge down on our heads if we're not careful, but possible." "Will you help us?" Khloe asked. "Depends. What's in it for me?" "Half of whatever gold we recover," Hyram offered Hassid. Murphy's eyes sharpened with interest. "And if we don't find enough to pay your debt, then we lose our home and you've wasted a week of your time. But if we do find enough, then you'll have made more money in a week than most men see in a year." Murphy grinned, showing teeth stained brown from years of pipe smoking. "Well then, when do we start?" The next 3 days passed in a blur of back-breaking labor and carefully controlled explosions. Murphy proved to be a master of his craft, able to place charges with surgical precision that moved tons of rock without bringing down the entire mountainside. Working by the light of lanterns when darkness fell, they carved a new channel that would redirect a portion of Thunder Ridge's water flow directly into the section of Willow Creek, where they'd found the most promising deposits. Khloe worked alongside the men, hauling rock and preparing equipment, her hands bleeding despite the heavy gloves Murphy had insisted she wear. This was harder physical labor than anything she'd ever attempted, but every muscle that ached and every blister that formed felt like a step closer to saving their home. "Tomorrow we test the system," Murphy announced on the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat around their campfire, too exhausted to do more than eat and plan for the final push. "Will it work?" Khloe asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "In theory," Murphy replied, "the water pressure should be enough to wash the gold-bearing gravel downstream to where you can collect it more easily. But theory and practice are 2 different things, especially when you're dealing with mountain water and dynamite. And if it doesn't work," Murphy shrugged with the philosophical acceptance of a man who'd gambled on longer odds, "then we'll have given it our best shot, and that's more than most folks can say." On the 4th morning, they were ready to test their improvised hydraulic mining system. The blast that opened their new channel sent a shower of rock and debris cascading down the mountainside, followed by a torrent of water that hit Willow Creek with the force of a miniature flood. For the first few minutes, the creek ran dark with sediment and debris, making it impossible to see whether their plan was working. But as the water began to clear, Khloe saw something that made her heart race with excitement. Flashes of gold in the streambed, more than they'd found in all their previous prospecting combined. "It's working," she breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "It's working," Hyram confirmed, his voice filled with wonder and relief. They worked feverishly for the next 2 days, collecting gold-bearing gravel as fast as the enhanced water flow could wash it downstream. Murphy proved invaluable not just for his blasting expertise, but for his knowledge of how to process large quantities of material efficiently. By the evening of the 6th day, they had accumulated a coffee can full of gold dust and small nuggets more precious metal than any of them had ever seen in one place. "How much do you think it's worth?" Khloe asked as they sat around their final campfire, the can of gold gleaming in the firelight like captured stars. Murphy, who had more experience in such matters, examined their collection carefully. "Hard to say without proper assaying, but I'd estimate close to $3,000, maybe more if some of these larger nuggets are as pure as they look." $3,000, enough to pay Crane's demands, and still have money left over to start their new life with a cushion of security they'd never dared to imagine. "We did it," Khloe said wonderingly. "We actually did it." "That we did, lass," Murphy agreed, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "Though I'll admit there were moments when I thought we were all completely mad." "We probably were," Hyram said, but he was smiling as he said it. "But sometimes being a little mad is the only way to accomplish the impossible." As they prepared to break camp and return to the cabin, Khloe felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond the mere accumulation of wealth. They had faced an impossible situation and found a way through it together. They had turned desperation into determination and fear into the kind of love that was strong enough to move mountains, or at least to blast new channels through them. Tomorrow they would confront Bartholomew Crane with their hard-won treasure, but tonight they could rest in the knowledge that they had saved their home and their future through courage, ingenuity, and the kind of partnership that could overcome any obstacle. The mountains around them stood silent and eternal witnesses to their struggle and ultimate triumph. In the morning they would begin the journey back to their life together, but for now they sat by the fire and watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, each point of light a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always hope for those brave enough to reach for it. The morning sun painted the peaks rose gold as they loaded their precious cargo into the wagon for the journey back to Gunnison. Murphy had agreed to accompany them to town, partly to collect his promised share of the gold, and partly Khloe suspected because he wanted to see Bartholomew Crane's face when they produced enough wealth to satisfy every debt, and then some. "You sure that's all secure?" Hyram asked for the third time, checking the leather pouch that held their hard-won treasure. "Secure as I can make it," Khloe replied, patting the spot where the pouch rested, hidden beneath her shawl. "Though I have to admit, I'll feel better once this business is finished." The ride down from Thunder Ridge felt different than any journey they'd made before, where once the mountain trails had seemed like paths to adventure or escape. Now they felt like roads leading to resolution, the final chapter of a story that had begun with Khloe stepping off a dusty stagecoach and declaring herself too big for anyone to want. "Nervous?" Hyram asked as they approached the outskirts of Gunnison. "Excited," Khloe corrected, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For the first time since Crane arrived, I feel like we're the ones holding the winning hand." They found the debt collector in the hotel dining room finishing what appeared to be an expensive breakfast. He looked up with his usual calculating smile as they approached, but Khloe noticed that his expression shifted slightly when he saw Murphy behind them. "Mrs. Boon, Mr. Boon," Crane said, rising from his chair with exaggerated courtesy. "I wasn't expecting to see you until tomorrow. I do hope you've come to accept our generous offer regarding your property." "Actually, we've come to settle the debt," Hyram said calmly. "All of it." Crane's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "I see. And how exactly do you propose to do that? As I understand it, the amount owed is somewhat beyond the means of mountain farmers." Without a word, Khloe reached beneath her shawl and withdrew the leather pouch. She set it on the table between them with a soft thud that spoke of significant weight. $1,247, she said quietly. "Plus interest, plus your collection fees, plus any other charges you want to add. Count it." Crane stared at the pouch as if it might contain a snake instead of gold. "I'm sorry, what exactly is this payment in full?" Murphy said cheerfully, his Irish accent thick with amusement. "Though I have to say you might want to have it properly assayed before you refuse it. Gold prices being what they are and all." The word gold hung in the air like a thunderclap, Crane's pale eyes fixed on the pouch with an intensity that made his previous calculating look seem friendly by comparison. "You're claiming this contains gold sufficient to pay a debt of over $1,200. "I'm not claiming anything," Khloe replied evenly. "I'm stating it as fact. Open the pouch and see for yourself." With hands that weren't quite steady, Crane untied the leather strings and poured a small portion of the contents onto the white tablecloth. Even in the dim light of the hotel dining room, the gold dust and nuggets gleamed with unmistakable authenticity. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Does it matter?" Hyram asked. "Legal mining claim legally extracted, legally owned, unless you're questioning the legitimacy of our payment." Crane's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "I'll need to have this assayed before I can accept it as payment." "Fine," Khloe said. "We'll wait." The assayer's office was a short walk from the hotel, and word of the unusual transaction spread through the small town like wildfire. By the time they emerged with the official weight and purity measurements, a small crowd had gathered to witness the conclusion of what had become Gunnison's most interesting drama in months. $1,432, the assayer announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, at current Denver prices for gold of this quality. The crowd murmured with appreciation and not a little amazement. More than one person was heard to remark that it was the largest single gold transaction they'd ever witnessed in Gunnison. Crane's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure as they returned to the hotel to complete the transaction. "Very well," he said stiffly. "I'll accept payment of $1,247 in gold as agreed. Plus interest," Khloe reminded him, "plus a $20 collection fee," Crane added through gritted teeth. "That leaves us with over $160, Murphy observed helpfully. "Quite a profit for a week's work, I'd say." As Crane counted out the gold that satisfied the debt, his hands shook with what might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. When he was finished, he produced a legal document from his coat pocket. "This certifies that all debts owed by Mrs. Khloe Boon, formerly Stoltzfus, have been paid in full," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "You're free and clear of all obligations." Khloe took the paper with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the overwhelming relief of seeing her past debts finally laid to rest. "Thank you, Mr. Crane." "Don't thank me," he replied curtly. "You've cost my consortium a considerable profit." "Your consortium gambled that we couldn't pay," Hyram said quietly. "Sometimes gamblers lose." As they prepared to leave the hotel, Crane called after them one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a note of threat. "There are other ways to collect what's owed." Murphy turned back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Crane, I'd be very careful about making threats in a town full of miners who've just seen their neighbors strike it rich. Mountain folk tend to be protective of their own." The debt collector's face went even paler, and he said nothing more as they walked out into the bright Colorado sunshine. "Well then," Murphy said cheerfully as they stood on the hotel steps, "that was even more entertaining than I'd expected. Nothing like watching a bully back down when his victims refuse to be intimidated." "I can't believe it's really over," Khloe said, still staring at the paper that declared her free of all debts. "It's over," Hyram confirmed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We're free to build whatever life we want now." They treated Murphy to the finest dinner Gunnison's hotel could provide, and as the evening wore on, the Irishman regaled them with stories of other mining ventures, other fortunes won and lost in the unforgiving mountains of Colorado territory. "You know," he said as they shared a bottle of whiskey that Hyram had purchased to celebrate their victory, "you two have done something most people only dream about. You faced an impossible situation and found a way through it together." "We had help," Khloe said, raising her glass to him. "We couldn't have done any of this without you." "Ah, but you could have," Murphy replied with a knowing smile. "Maybe not the way we did it, but you'd have found another way. People with your kind of determination always do." As the evening wound down and Murphy prepared to return to his own claims, he shook hands with both of them and offered a piece of advice that would stay with them for years to come. "Don't let the gold change you," he said seriously. "I've seen it happen to good people. They find a little wealth and forget what really matters. Remember that the treasure isn't what you pulled out of that mountain. The treasure is what you built together while you were pulling it out." The next morning they began the journey back to their cabin, their wagon lighter by several pounds of gold, but somehow feeling more substantial than when they'd left. The mountain air seemed cleaner, the peaks more beautiful, and the future more promising. than Khloe had ever dared to imagine. "What do you want to do first?" Hyram asked as they climbed the familiar trail toward home. "Sleep in our own bed," Khloe replied without hesitation. "Then maybe sit on our porch and drink coffee and remember what it feels like to not be worried about losing everything." And after that, Khloe considered the question as the cabin came into view, looking exactly as they'd left it, but somehow different, not just a shelter now, but a true home that belonged to them, free and clear. "After that," she said slowly, "I think we plan for the future, a real future built on what we've learned about each other and about what we can accomplish when we work together." The cabin welcomed them back with the kind of warmth that only comes from returning to a place where you truly belong. As they unloaded their supplies and settled back into the routine of daily life, Khloe found herself marveling at how much had changed since that terrifying morning when Jake Morrison had arrived with Crane's letter. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Hyram broke the comfortable silence with a question that had obviously been on his mind. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Answering my advertisement, coming all this way to marry a stranger." Khloe turned to look at him, this gentle giant who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had been willing to risk everything to protect what they'd built together. "Never," she said firmly. "Even when things looked hopeless, even when I thought we might lose everything, I never regretted choosing you. Even though I brought you nothing but trouble and debt and hard work, Hyram Boon," she said, reaching over to take his hand, "you brought me home. Everything else was just details we had to work through together." They talked late into the night, making plans for the future that stretched out before them like an uncharted territory full of possibilities. They would expand the garden, improve the cabin, maybe even start a small herd of cattle. With their debt settled and money in the bank, they could afford to dream beyond mere survival. "There's something else I want to do," Khloe said as they prepared for bed. "Something I've been thinking about since we paid off Crane." "What's that?" "I want to write to my family back in Pennsylvania. Tell them about our life here, about what we've built together. Maybe some of them would like to visit, see that there's life beyond the narrow world they know." Hyram smiled, recognizing the generosity of spirit that had first drawn him to her. "I think that's a wonderful idea. This place is big enough to share with people who matter to you." As autumn settled over the mountains and their first year together drew to a close, Khloe and Hyram fell into the rhythms of married life with the ease of two people who'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. The work was still hard, the winters still long and challenging, but they faced each day with the confidence that came from knowing they could handle whatever difficulties arose. Word of their successful gold strike had spread throughout the territory, bringing visitors and opportunity to their remote valley. Some came seeking advice about mining, others hoping to purchase supplies or horses. A few were young couples looking for examples of how to build a life in the wilderness, drawn by stories of the widow who'd been too big for anyone to want, and the mountain man who'd seen her true worth. "We're becoming famous," Hyram observed one day as yet another group of visitors made their way up the trail to their cabin. "Not famous," Khloe corrected, serving coffee to a young couple from Kansas who'd come seeking their advice about homesteading. "Just proof that good things can happen when people are brave enough to take chances on each other." Winter arrived early that year, but instead of the lonely isolation that had once marked the season for Hyram, it brought cozy evenings by the fire, shared meals, and the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. They read together from the books that visitors brought as gifts, played checkers and card games, and planned improvements for the coming spring. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Hyram surprised Khloe with a gift that brought tears to her eyes, a wooden sign for their cabin that read, "Boon's Rest, home of Hyram and Khloe Boon Est, 1875. "Now it's official," he said, as they hung the sign by their front door. "This isn't just where we live, it's our family home." That evening, as they sat by their fire and watched snow fall softly outside their windows, Khloe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a woman convinced she was too much for anyone to want boarding a stagecoach with nothing but hope and desperation driving her forward. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" she asked Hyram, "when all those people were staring and whispering. "I said you were perfect," he replied without hesitation, "and I couldn't believe you meant it." Hyram set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Khloe, I need you to understand something. That wasn't kindness talking or pity or any attempt to make you feel better. That was the absolute truth, as I saw it then and as I see it now." "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything about you, your strength, your courage, your determination, even your size, all of it was exactly what I'd been praying for without knowing how to ask. You weren't too big for me, Khloe. You were exactly big enough." The words hung between them like a benediction, carrying the weight of everything they'd experienced together and everything they'd learned about love and partnership and the courage it takes to build a life with another person. "I love you, Hyram Boon," she said simply. "I love you too, Khloe Boon," he replied, "more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." Outside their window, the snow continued to fall, covering their mountain valley in pristine white that would melt in spring to feed the streams and nurture new growth. Inside their cabin, two people who'd found each other against all odds sat by their fire and planned for all the tomorrows that stretched ahead of them. They had faced the worst that life could throw at them and emerged not just intact but stronger, their love tempered by adversity and proven by trial. They had learned that real wealth wasn't measured in gold or property, but in the willingness to stand together against whatever challenges arose. As the evening wore on and they prepared for bed, Khloe caught sight of herself in the mirror above their dresser. The woman looking back at her was still tall, still curved, in ways that defied convention, but she no longer saw someone who was too much for the world to handle. She saw Khloe Boon, wife and partner, and beloved, a woman who'd found her proper place in the world through the simple miracle of being seen and valued exactly as she was. The mountains stood eternal around their valley, witnesses to their love story and guardians of their future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight they were simply two people who'd found their way to each other through courage, determination, and the kind of love that was strong enough to move mountains, or at least to blast new channels through them when the need arose. As sleep finally claimed them, Khloe's last conscious thought was of gratitude for the courage that had brought her west, for the man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, and for the life they'd built together, one choice, one challenge, one triumph at a time. In the months and years that followed, their story would be told and retold throughout Colorado territory and beyond, the tale of the Amish widow who thought she was too big for love, and the mountain man who showed her she was perfect just as she was. But for now, they slept peacefully in their mountain home, two hearts beating in rhythm with each other and with the eternal pulse of the wilderness that had brought them together and made them whole. The first spring after their triumph over Bartholomew Crane brought changes to the mountain valley that neither Khloe nor Hyram could have anticipated. Word of their story had spread far beyond Colorado territory, carried by travelers, miners, and newspaper correspondents who'd heard tell of the couple who'd struck gold, not just in the earth, but in each other. "There's another letter," Hyram announced one morning in early May, returning from his monthly trip to Gunnison with their May mail and supplies. "This one's from a newspaper in San Francisco." Khloe looked up from the garden. She was expanding, her hands dirty from transplanting seedlings, but her eyes bright with curiosity. "What do they want?" "Same as the others. They want to interview us, write our story for their readers. Apparently tales of mail-order brides and mountain gold strikes sell newspapers." Over the past months, they'd received similar requests from publications across the West and even from back east. The story had grown in the telling as stories do, until some versions bore little resemblance to their actual experience. In one account, Khloe had been a giantess who could split logs with her bare hands, while Hyram had become a hermit who'd lived alone for 20 years before love transformed him into a prosperous mining magnate. "We should probably answer this one," Khloe said, wiping her hands on her apron. "If we don't tell our own story, other people will keep making up their own versions." That evening, they sat at their kitchen table composing a response to the San Francisco Chronicle, trying to find words that would capture the truth of their experience without making it sound like a fairy tale. "Dear editor," Khloe dictated, while Hyram wrote in his careful script, "We have received your request for information about our courtship and marriage. While we appreciate the interest we feel, it's important that people understand our story is not about dramatic transformations or miraculous discoveries, but about two ordinary people who found the courage to see past society's expectations to the truth underneath." As Hyram wrote, they were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Through their window, they could see a small wagon making its way up the trail, driven by a woman in a dark traveling dress, with a young girl beside her. "More visitors," Hyram observed, setting down his pen. "That's the third group this week." They stepped out onto the porch to greet their unexpected guests, and Khloe felt her breath catch as she recognized the woman climbing down from the wagon. Sarah Miller had been her closest friend back in Pennsylvania, a fellow widow who'd been among the few people to show Khloe genuine kindness during her difficult years with Ezra's family. "Sarah," Khloe called out in amazement. "Sarah, is that really you?" The two women embraced with tears and laughter, while the young girl, Sarah's daughter Emma, now grown tall and serious at 14, hung back shyly until Khloe drew her into the reunion. "I had to see for myself," Sarah explained as they carried her bags into the cabin. "When your letter reached us describing this place and what you'd accomplished, I could hardly believe it. The Khloe I knew back home was convinced she'd never find happiness anywhere." "What brought you all this way?" Hyram asked as they settled around the kitchen table with coffee and the cake Khloe had baked that morning. Sarah's expression grew serious, partly curiosity but mostly desperation. "Things back in Pennsylvania have gotten difficult for widows like myself. The community leaders have decided that women without husbands are a burden on the church, and they're pressuring us to remarry or leave." "Who are they trying to marry you to?" Khloe asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Old men mostly, widowers who need housekeepers more than wives, or men who've never married, because no sensible woman would have them." Sarah's voice carried a bitterness that reminded Khloe of her own feelings just 2 years before. "They told me I should be grateful for any man willing to take on a woman with a half-grown daughter." Emma spoke up for the first time since arriving. "They said I'd be lucky if any decent family would take me as a servant after mother remarries." The casual cruelty of the statement made Khloe's heart ache. She remembered all too well the feeling of being seen as a burden, a problem to be solved rather than a person with her own worth and desires. "How long can you stay?" she asked. "As long as you'll have us," Sarah replied. "I've sold everything I owned back home to pay for this journey. Emma and I are starting over just like you did." Over the following days, Khloe and Hyram learned more about the changes that had swept through their former community. A new minister had arrived, one who preached that women should be silent and subservient, that independent thinking was a sin, and that any woman who couldn't find a husband was clearly defective in God's eyes. "It sounds like the place got even worse after I left," Khloe said as she showed Sarah around their property. "I thought I was the only one who felt trapped there." "You were just the first one brave enough to leave," Sarah replied. "Your letters describing this life, this freedom to make your own choices, they gave the rest of us hope that there might be another way." The hope in her friend's voice sparked an idea in Khloe's mind, one that grew stronger as the days passed, and she watched Emma begin to relax and smile for the first time since their arrival. The girl had been so crushed by constant criticism back home that she'd forgotten how to be a child. But here in the mountains, surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when people were allowed to grow and thrive, she was beginning to bloom again. "Hyram," Khloe said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Sarah and Emma explore the creek bank. "What would you think about building another cabin for Sarah and Emma, for them and for others like them, women who need a place to start over to discover who they really are when they're not being told constantly what they should be?" Hyram considered the idea thoughtfully. "It would be a big undertaking. We'd need more cleared land, additional water sources, probably a larger garden to feed more people. But it's possible. Everything's possible if you're willing to work for it," he replied with a smile. "The question is whether Sarah would want to stay permanently or if she's just passing through." They broached the subject with Sarah the next morning, and the relief in her expression was answer enough. "You'd really want us to stay?" she asked. "Even though Emma and I would just be 2 more mouths to feed." "Sarah Miller," Khloe said firmly, "you're one of the strongest, most capable women I know. You raised a daughter alone, managed a household, and had the courage to travel halfway across the country to build a new life. The question isn't whether we want you to stay, it's whether you'd be willing to help us build something bigger than just our own little homestead." "What do you mean?" Khloe looked at Hyram, who nodded encouragingly. "I mean a place where women like us can come to start over, where they can learn that being different doesn't mean being wrong, and where they can discover their own strength without being told it's unwomanly." The idea took shape over the following weeks as they planned and discussed and refined their vision. They would build additional cabins, expand the garden, and create what they began calling Boon's Rest, not just a home for their own family, but a refuge for women who needed time and space to heal from the wounds inflicted by a world that saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be valued. News of their plans spread quickly through the network of correspondence Khloe had maintained with friends and family back east. By midsummer, they'd received inquiries from a dozen women asking about the possibility of joining their community. "We're going to need help with the construction," Hyram said, as they surveyed the site where they planned to build the first additional cabin. "This is more work than the 3 of us can handle alone." "What about Murphy?" Khloe suggested. "He might know other men who'd be willing to work for fair wages and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about what we're building." Murphy proved enthusiastic about the project, partly because it meant steady work through the summer, and partly because he appreciated the unconventional nature of their enterprise. "You're starting a revolution," he told them one evening as they shared dinner after a long day of construction. "A quiet one, maybe, but a revolution all the same." "We're just giving people choices they didn't have before," Khloe protested. "Aye, and that's exactly what revolutions do," Murphy replied with a grin. "They show people that the way things are isn't the only way things can be." By August, they'd completed 2 additional cabins and were well into construction on a 3rd. The expanded garden was producing more vegetables than they'd ever imagined possible, and Sarah had proven invaluable in organizing the practical aspects of their growing community. The first new resident arrived in early September, a young widow named Mary Catherine, who'd written from Ohio describing a situation so similar to Sarah's that it might have been copied from the same tragic template. She'd been pressured to marry a man twice her age, who'd made it clear he expected her to be grateful for his willingness to overlook her advanced age of 26. "I couldn't do it," she told them on her first evening at Boon's Rest. "I kept thinking about your letter, about the possibility that there might be a place where being unmarried at 26 wasn't considered a tragedy." Mary Catherine had brought skills they desperately needed. She was an experienced seamstress and had some knowledge of bookkeeping. Within a week, she'd organized their finances and begun teaching Emma advanced needlework techniques that the girl absorbed with eager enthusiasm. October brought 2 more women, Rebecca, a school teacher who'd been dismissed from her position for teaching her female students mathematics, and Anna, whose family had disowned her for refusing an arranged marriage to a man who'd already buried 3 wives under suspicious circumstances. "We're becoming quite the collection of difficult women," Sarah observed one evening as they gathered around the large table Hyram had built to accommodate their growing household. "I prefer to think of us as a collection of women who refuse to accept that difficult circumstances make us difficult people," Khloe replied. The first winter tested their resolve and their resources in ways none of them had fully anticipated. 6 women and 1 man living in close quarters during the long mountain months discovered that good intentions didn't automatically translate into easy harmony. There were disagreements about work assignments, conflicts over personal space, and moments when the pressure of creating something entirely new while dealing with their individual past traumas threatened to tear their fragile community apart. The crisis came in January during a blizzard that trapped them all inside for nearly a week. Tensions that had been building for months finally exploded when Rebecca accused Anna of not pulling her weight with the household chores, and Anna responded by questioning Rebecca's qualifications to teach anyone about cooperation. "Maybe this was a mistake," Sarah said quietly to Khloe, as they cleaned up after a particularly heated argument. "Maybe we're too different, too damaged by our past experiences to build something healthy together." Khloe looked around their main cabin where the other women sat in uncomfortable silence, each wrapped in her own hurt and frustration. For a moment she felt the familiar doubt creeping in the old voice that whispered she was too much, too big, too ambitious in her dreams. Then she thought about the girl. She'd been back in Pennsylvania convinced she had no value because she didn't fit into someone else's narrow definition of acceptable womanhood. She thought about Emma, who'd arrived shy and beaten down, but was now thriving in an environment that celebrated her quick mind and independent spirit. She thought about all of them. Really women who'd been told their whole lives that they were problems to be solved rather than people with inherent worth and infinite potential. "We're not too different," she said finally, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "We're exactly different enough. The world tried to convince each of us that our differences made us wrong, but what if our differences are actually what make us strong?" She stood up and moved to the center of the room, where she could see all of their faces in the firelight. "Rebecca, you were fired for teaching girls mathematics because someone decided that women shouldn't be good with numbers. But look at how you've helped us organize our finances and plan for the future. Anna, your family cast you out for refusing to marry a man you knew would hurt you. But your courage in standing up for yourself has inspired Emma to believe she can choose her own path. Sarah, you were told you were a burden because you had a child to raise alone. But you've been the heart of this community, the one who keeps us all connected to our better selves." The room had grown quiet, and Khloe could see something shifting in the faces around her. "Mary Catherine, you were considered an old maid at 26 because you hadn't found a man willing to settle for you. But you brought skills we desperately needed and a spirit of generosity that makes this place feel like home. And all of us together, we're building something that didn't exist before, something that proves women can create their own definitions of success and happiness." "What about you?" Emma asked quietly. "What were you told was wrong with you?" Khloe smiled, remembering that terrifying day when she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Gunnison, convinced she was too big for anyone to want. "I was told I was too much of everything, too tall, too strong, too independent, too sure of my own mind. I believed it for so long that I almost let it keep me from the life I really wanted." "And now," Rebecca asked, "now I know that being too much for some people just means you haven't found your people yet. And these," she gestured around the room, "these are my people. We're all too much for the world we came from, but we're exactly enough for the world we're building here." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn as each woman shared her story and her fears and her hopes for what they were creating together. By the time the sun rose over the snow-covered peaks, they'd established new agreements about how they would live and work together But more importantly, they'd rediscovered their shared commitment to proving that women could thrive when given the freedom to define themselves. Spring brought new challenges and new arrivals. Word of Boon's rest had spread through networks of correspondence and informal communication until they were receiving letters from women as far away as New York and California. Some came seeking temporary refuge while they figured out their next steps. Others arrived hoping to become permanent members of their growing community. By their second summer, they were operating what amounted to a small village. They'd built a schoolhouse where Rebecca taught children from the surrounding area, a workshop where Mary Catherine and others produced quilts and clothing that they sold in Gunnison and Denver, and a large communal kitchen that served as the heart of their daily life. "We should write a book," Sarah suggested one evening as they sat on the expanded porch watching their children play in the creek, while the adults planned the next day's work. "About what?" Khloe asked. "About this. About what we've learned about building a life that works for women who don't fit the usual patterns, about how to create a community based on what people can contribute rather than what they're supposed to lack." The idea appealed to Khloe, but she wondered who would want to read such a book. "You'd be surprised," Murphy said when they mentioned the idea to him. "I've carried letters to a lot of places in my travels, and everywhere I go, I meet women who are looking for examples of how to live differently. What you've built here, it's not just a curiosity, it's a blueprint." That autumn, Khloe began writing, spending her evenings by the fire, recording not just their story, but the stories of all the women who'd found their way to Boon's rest. She wrote about the practical challenges of building a self-sustaining community, but also about the emotional work of healing from years of being told you weren't enough. "The most important thing we've learned," she wrote, "is that there's no such thing as being too much of yourself. There are only places and people who aren't ready for what you have to offer. The answer isn't to make yourself smaller, it's to find or create spaces where you can grow to your full size." The book, when it was finally published 2 years later, created a sensation. Women's rights advocates praised it as a practical guide to female independence, while critics condemned it as a dangerous attack on traditional family values. But for the women who read it, it served as something much simpler and more vital proof that alternative ways of living were possible. Letters poured in from readers around the world, many of them from women who'd been inspired to make changes in their own lives. Some started their own communities, others simply found the courage to resist pressure to marry men they didn't love or take jobs that diminished their spirits. "We've become accidental revolutionaries," Hyram observed one day as they read through the latest batch of correspondence. "Not revolutionaries," Khloe corrected, "just women who refused to believe that the way things were was the way things had to be." As the 5th anniversary of their marriage approached, Khloe and Hyram found themselves reflecting on how far they'd traveled from that first tentative meeting in Gunnison. Their mountain valley now housed nearly 20 women and children, along with a handful of men who'd proven they could respect and support their unconventional community. "Do you ever miss it?" Hyram asked one evening as they walked alone through the garden that now sprawled across several acres. "The quiet life, just the two of us." Khloe considered the question seriously. She loved their expanded family and took pride in what they'd built, but she also treasured the intimate partnership that remained at the center of everything. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she admitted, "but I don't miss feeling like we were the only people in the world who thought life could be different than what we'd been told to expect." "And I love watching you become who you were always meant to be," Hyram said, stopping to face her in the gathering dusk. "Back when we first met, you were so convinced you were too big for the world. Now you've created a world that's big enough for everyone." As they walked back toward their cabin where lights were beginning to flicker on and the sounds of evening conversations drifted from open windows, Khloe felt a deep sense of completion. Not the kind that meant their story was over, but the kind that meant they'd found their purpose. She thought about the girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach 5 years ago, terrified and convinced she was too much for anyone to want. That girl could never have imagined this life, this community, this sense of belonging not just to one person, but to a chosen family of women who'd all found the courage to rewrite their own stories. "Thank you," she said quietly as they reached their front door. "For what?" "For seeing me," she replied. "For seeing all of us, for understanding that being different isn't the same as being wrong." As they settled into their evening routine, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of their unconventional but thriving community, Khloe realized that this was what true success looked like, not the accumulation of wealth or the achievement of conventional milestones, but the creation of spaces where people could grow into their authentic selves without apology or explanation. The mountains stood eternal around their valley, witnesses to the transformation of a place that had once been just one man's refuge into a beacon of hope for women seeking to write their own definitions of home, family, and belonging. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, as every night, they were exactly where they belonged, too big for the world they'd left behind, but perfectly sized for the world they'd built together.